Ross?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
In terms of your experience, I understand prior to becoming the assistant dean, you were a long-term substitute over in Lake Orion.
That is correct, yes.
And you have a degree in what?
I have a master's degree in education and human development and a bachelor's degree in sociology.
And did you ever have any training specific to disciplining students or discipline issues?
Yes, on-the-job training.
When you say you had on-the-job training, where was that?
So my job previous to being a long-term substitute teacher, I was the dean of students for an alternative program in charge of behavior and discipline. And then I spent 3 years for Brandon School District as an intervention specialist. And so I specifically dealt with student behavior.
In the trainings you did, were you taught signs of things to look for in students that would have discipline issues?
Yes, I was.
I believe you mentioned that one of those signs that you would know to look for in terms of thinking about what, if you need to search their backpack, would be whether they seem nervous when you're holding their materials, correct?
Yes.
Now, in this case, there was a time where you walked down to the classroom and retrieved Mrs. Crumbley's son's backpack.
Yes.
And you carried that backpack to the office where you were meeting with Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Crumbley's son, Mrs. Crumbley's son.
Yes.
When you carried that backpack back to Mrs. Crumbley's son, he did not appear to be nervous at all that you were holding his backpack.
He didn't appear to even care that I was holding his backpack.
And so based on him not caring or showing signs of nervousness, you had no concern there was anything in that bag.
I had no reasonable suspicion to search his belongings, no.
You did make the observation that that bag felt unusually heavy.
That is not correct.
Did you ever make the observation about how heavy the bag seemed?
I made a joke to Miss Morgan at how easily she picked it up and then handed it to me and my arm dropped. And so it was more of a joke of how strong she was compared to handing it off to me.
I see. So you had training through your employment with the Brandon School District. Is that
Correct, yes.
You had training when you were working on your undergraduate degree.
Correct, yes.
You obviously have your advanced master's degree.
That is correct.
You have the experience from working in the school across state.
That is correct.
And you probably have attended other seminars and things to keep up to date on any recent developments in this area.
Yes.
How many additional hours would you say you've spent in those additional trainings?
I'm not sure.
Are you required to do a certain number per year?
No, I'm not.
But you do those trainings?
Yes.
Have you done more than one training?
Yes.
More than 5?
No.
So your main job or responsibility at Oxford High School was to be in charge of discipline issues with the students.
That was one of them, yes.
And when you were looking at any situation involving Mrs. Crumbley's son, there was nothing that you determined required a disciplinary action.
There was nothing that had required discipline in that situation, no.
So we talked yesterday about how Mrs. Crumbley's son was caught looking up bullets during class time.
Yes.
There was no discipline needed after he's looking up bullets in a classroom?
That doesn't reach to the level where there would be a consequence.
And with respect to that issue, there was a phone call and a voicemail left for Mrs. Crumbley.
That is correct.
You were present when Ms. Fine left the message?
I was not present when she left the message.
Mr. Hopkins was present when the message was left.
I can't speak to that.
Thank you. As far as you knew, Mrs. Crumbley was not asked to come to the school regarding the bullets?
As far as I know, she wasn't, no.
And Mrs. Crumbley was not asked to call back to the school, as far as you know?
She was asked to return the phone call if she had any questions about what had occurred.
But not asked to return the phone call no matter what?
No, we often just give parents phone calls when we meet with students, regardless of the issue, just to keep them informed on what we talked about, without a request to return the phone call.
Now, when you were speaking with the prosecutor, you were shown exhibit number 158. I'm going to pull that up on the screen. Okay, so I've got 158 up there. And this is an email chain that went between Miss Kubina and yourself. Is that correct? I'm sorry, I'll back up. I can see that this went between Miss Kubina and Sean Hopkins. Were you made aware of the contents within this email that's in Exhibit 158?
Yes.
And in Exhibit 158, Ms. Kubina wrote, not only was he looking up the bullets, but that when she reviewed his previous work that he's completed, it leans towards the violent side, correct?
That's what it says, correct.
Did you go and ask Ms. Kubina to provide you some of the work he completed that appeared violent?
I did not do that, as it wasn't necessary.
So it was not necessary for you to specifically speak with Ms. Crumbley in any way about the bullets, drawing, or research?
It was not necessary.
And it was not necessary for you to look at what were described as violent side indications in his prior work?
It was not necessary because another staff member had already taken care of this issue, so I didn't need to get involved any further.
And you did not mention to Mrs. Crumbley at any point in time that a teacher had described prior work of her son to be on the violent side?
Can you rephrase the question?
Sure. Did you ever talk to Mrs. Crumbley that there was an indication from a teacher that her son had prior work that leaned on the violent side?
During the meeting that we had on the 30th.
You're saying you discussed...
We discussed that during the meeting we had on the 30th.
But at that time, you didn't even have the violent leaning materials, correct?
That is correct, yeah.
And you didn't show her any of the examples that you would say would be violent leaning materials?
I didn't have those to show her, no.
And as far as you were aware, well, I'll ask if you were you aware if anyone ever discussed violent leaning drawings or violent leaning work in the past with Mrs. Crumbley? Are you aware?
I'm not aware of that, and nor there was any documentation prior to this that would describe that.
Now, on November 30th, we know that you were told inappropriate things were being drawn on the math paper. Or you testified that inappropriate things were drawn on the math paper, correct?
That is correct.
And when you're talking about the math paper, you're speaking about what we see in Exhibit 74 that has drawings and writings by Mrs. Crumbley's son on the paper.
That is correct.
You're aware that Mrs. Crumbley's son was drawing these things and writing these words during class time when he was supposed to be working on this review, correct?
Yep.
And that did not create a discipline issue to you?
When he's seen for mental health, that supersedes any type of minor violation that this would potentially rise to, but this doesn't violate any of the code of our conduct. So there wouldn't be discipline, and as I mentioned, because of the fact that he was being seen by his counselor for mental health, that's what takes precedence in the situation.
That was explained to Mrs. Crumbley. This is not a discipline issue. Your son is not in trouble for this drawing, correct?
Yes.
And you explained to Mrs. Crumbley, we're concerned about mental health, not disciplining him for this drawing.
Yes.
And during that meeting, it was a conclusion by you that this was not, you and Mr. Hopkins together, that this was not a discipline issue, but a mental health issue.
So I was there for discipline and behavior, so that question was posed to me to make that call as part of my job.
And what was the call you made?
The call that I made was that there's no discipline warranted, that I'm more concerned that he gets the help that he needs.
During that meeting, were you aware that another teacher had reported Mrs. Crumbley's son was looking at a violent video in class?
Yes, that is why Sean thought that I had come to his office that morning. So he had shared that he had gotten that email from the other teacher.
Did you ask to see the violent video that Mrs. Crumbley's son had been watching while he was in class?
I did not ask to see that, as it wasn't necessary.
You found it to not be necessary to take a look at the video that he had been watching?
No.
You didn't even ask Mrs. Crumbley's son, hey, can I see it? Take a look at that video.
Well, since it was described as not like a live event, and due to the fact that most teenagers are watching violent movies, video games, pre-recorded on YouTube, it doesn't rise to the occasion where you would be concerned.
And it also didn't rise to the occasion that you felt he should be disciplined for watching a video during class time.
That also wouldn't rise to the occasion of a violation of our code of conduct. That would be more of a teacher-managed behavior. You would never be suspended for that, or it wouldn't rise to that occasion.
Okay. I went to school in a different day and age where you had to do school during school. So it sounds to me like during school, Oxford High School allows more freedom than what I experienced. So it was okay that he was looking at the bullets. That's not a discipline issue.
It's not that it was okay, it just doesn't rise to the occasion that you receive a suspension as a consequence. We have to rely on restorative practices instead of going right to suspension, as you mentioned that you might have experienced when you were in school. And we have to consider how the student's behavior interferes with the day and discuss that with them and talk about how we can move forward. And that has to be considered for all minor violations before you would ever consider a suspension. And that's something that we have to do by law.
So, when you're considering all of these things, you're ultimately concluding these are minor violations, if they're violations at all, correct?
That is correct.
The looking at bullets in the classroom.
Yes.
The looking at a violent video on his phone.
Yes.
The drawings on this math paper.
Yes.
The drawings on the amended math paper where Mrs. Crumbley's son made other marks on the page.
So the drawings at the moment were not as important as a standout as the statements were. So when you have the explanation of the desire to design video games, and that's how he was practicing the drawing, and you have the parents confirm that information, it lowers the level of concern immensely.
So you took into account the context of what you were understanding, and that was part of what helped you conclude this was not a disciplinary issue.
That is correct.
Now, in terms of any disciplinary issues with Mrs. Crumbley's son prior, would those show up on Power Schools?
They would, yes.
it's fair to say that when you look at power schools, you don't see any history of disciplinary action against Mrs. Crumbley's son.
There was no history of discipline for Mrs. Crumbley's son.
All of his grades are available to be seen. Mrs. Crumbley's son, while he may not have had the best grades, had overall passing grades.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Pretty average for a student at the time, yes.
And when you're on power schools, you can also see attendance records and be able to tell if the student was in school often or missed school often, correct?
Yes.
And it appears from power schools that Mrs. Crumbley's son had very regular, very good attendance.
He did have regular attendance, yes.
So when you are looking at Mrs. Crumbley's son, it's fair to say he comes to you with no history that would cause you to be on higher alert.
That is correct.
And when I asked about prior incidents of discipline or things along those lines, you did not see anything from the 2020 to 2021 school year documented regarding discipline.
No, we would be able to see anything that would be in the history of attending Oxford schools, and there wasn't anything.
When you heard the phone call to Mrs. Crumbley where she was asked, or it was suggested that a parent come to the school, her immediate reaction, you wanted to see her immediate reaction to seeing the paper from math class, correct?
Can you rephrase that question, please?
Sure, and I apologize. You testified that you wanted her immediate reaction when she saw the math paper you were dealing with, correct?
I wasn't looking for her immediate reaction. It was more, we're going to send you this that he just drew so you have it in front of you.
But you did end up getting her immediate reaction because
Yes.
she was on the phone at the time?
Yes.
On speakerphone?
Yes.
And you testified that her first reaction was to ask her son, what were you thinking? Why did you do this?
Yes.
When you call parents and say, I need a parent to come up here for a meeting, oftentimes one parent or the other comes to the school.
That's not necessarily true.
Well, there are times where both parents come to the school together.
Yes.
There are also times where one parent or the other parent come to the school.
Yeah, fair statement.
And when you're asking for a parent to come to the school, you are not specifically saying it has to be mom, or it has to be dad, or it has to be both, correct?
It just has to be whoever's legally allowed to, yes.
And in this case, legally allowed to would be both mom and dad, Mr. Crumbley and Mrs. Crumbley.
Yes.
So according to your request for a parent to come to the school, it's perfectly okay if it would be Mrs. Crumbley who comes, Mr. Crumbley who comes, or both parents.
Yes.
In this circumstance, both parents came to the school.
Correct.
And they both attended the meeting that lasted approximately 10 minutes, as you said.
Correct.
Now, this was the first time that you ever had the Crumbley parents come to the school regarding their son, correct?
That I was involved in? Yes.
And that you're aware of.
Yes.
You would have seen on power schools if Mrs. Crumbley had been up at the school many times the year before, or the year before that, or the year before that, correct?
It depending on the type of meeting, potentially. If they're meeting with a teacher, it probably wouldn't be listed in Power School.
So discipline meetings would have been on there, and you didn't see
Correct.
any history of Mrs. Crumbley coming to the school for discipline.
That's correct.
So she was a person that when she arrived, you did not know from prior occasions with, you had not had many communications or any communications with Mrs. Crumbley where you would know who she is or how she is.
That's correct.
During the meeting, Mr. Hopkins, supplied Mr. Crumbley and Mrs. Crumbley with the sheet of resources, including many therapists listed.
That's correct.
And on that sheet, there's also Common Ground is listed in some other mental health facilities.
I can't speak to what's included on the list.
During that meeting, you indicated to Mr. and Mrs. Crumbley that you wanted them to get counseling for their son.
I did not indicate that, no.
Mr. Hopkins did?
Yes.
But you agreed with that?
I do.
And when that happened, there was not any specific direction, you need to go to Common Ground.
No, the direction was as soon as possible, that day if possible.
As soon as possible, that day is possible, if possible, but it's okay if it was going to end up being on a different day.
I can't speak to that. I can speak to the statement that was made that Mr. Hopkins will be following up within 48 hours to ensure that they had made arrangements for that, which means they had 48 hours to secure some type of counseling.
And by secure some type of counseling, you mean scheduling an appointment, making steps to get mental health counseling, correct?
Correct, after they said they were not going to be taking their son out that day.
Now, during the meeting, well, as the Dean of Students, you're aware that there are some circumstances where children or students at Oxford High are not permitted to stay at school, correct?
There are situations where students wouldn't be permitted to stay at school, yes.
If a student comes to school and is positive for COVID, you would not allow the student to stay there.
That's a fair statement, yes.
If a student has a temperature and is sick, you would not allow the student to stay there.
We would request that they were picked up.
And if the parent said, no, I'm not going to get them, they're fine, the school would still say, no, you have to take them home, correct?
We've said that in the past and it still hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened where a parent hasn't taken the child home. Is that what you're saying? What
I'm saying is, in that specific case where students have had a fever and parents refuse to come pick them up, they remain at school. I've been in those situations before where parents were refusing to come pick them up.
So you end up letting parents, so there are times then where you want the child picked up, but they don't get picked up, and the school doesn't do anything about it to force the parents to come.
There's nothing that we have the power to do to force parents to do anything.
If you said, if there was a discipline issue, if you had looked at this as a discipline issue and told a parent, your child cannot stay here because of this discipline issue, you do have the authority to say you must take your child home, correct?
I have the authority to recommend that. However, I can't force them to do that. If it doesn't reach to a level where there's any type of illegal behavior, I wouldn't be able to do anything further than recommend that they get up there because the child cannot remain at school. But I can't force them to do anything.
Okay, but in this circumstance, in this particular circumstance, there was discussion where ultimately it was okay, in your mind, for Mrs. Crumbley's son to remain in school.
From a discipline standpoint, yes. There wasn't a reason to suspend him. There was no violation of our code of conduct that reaches the level of suspension.
And if you thought Mrs. Crumbley or Mr. Crumbley were neglecting their son medically, you are mandated by law to report that, correct?
Yep, absolutely.
So it's fair to say that even looking at it from a counseling mental health perspective, you did not find that Mr. Crumbley and Mrs. Crumbley were meeting a level of being so neglectful that you needed to call to report that, correct?
No, because I wasn't made aware of all the additional information that they were withholding.
It's important for you to have all the information you can, correct?
True, but I can't force people to share information with me.
You would also agree that the school had information they didn't share with Mrs. Crumbley.
We had shared all the information that we had with her at the time of the parent meeting.
you would agree with me that there has been claims of prior disciplinary issues that from your documentation in Power Schools is not even included, correct?
I wouldn't agree with that, no.
I'm sorry, did I misunderstand? Is those prior discipline issues are on there?
There weren't any prior discipline issues.
Right, so there's no prior discipline issues listed on there. You testified you never spoke with Mrs. Crumbley about discipline issues.
Yeah, that's correct.
So you don't have any evidence that Mrs. Crumbley received all the information that the school would have or could have known.
Can you rephrase that question?
You don't know that Mrs. Crumbley had received information about every specific situation with her son, correct?
The specific information discussed in the emails that was shared with Mrs. Crumbley.
Right. So on that day, you're discussing with her limited information compared to the whole picture.
It was the information that we had at the time. All the information we had was shared with her.
Are you saying that when they came in, you shared the emails with her too?
So the emails that we received from the teachers, correct.
Oh, okay. Okay.
At no point in time did you believe that Mrs. Crumbley's son posed a threat to the school.
He did not pose a threat to the school, no.
If he posed a threat to the school, that's something that you have been trained in to identify, correct?
Correct. We had previous threats that year that I handled completely different based on the fact that
they were
it was a
threats.
perceived threat, correct.
And when something is a threat, how is it that you handle it differently? Is the student allowed to stay in school? So you are the decision maker about whether or not there is a threat overall.
I wouldn't say that I'm the decision maker, but I have the power to heighten it to the level where we can get other people involved that can make a more informed decision.
And you're the one that has the training on that topic.
I'm one of them, yes.
And in this case, your conclusion was that the shooter's son was not a threat.
There was no threat present at the time, no.
You also took into account that what Mrs. Crumbley's son said made it sound like there were issues of sadness versus anything threatening, correct?
Correct, which is very typical of most teenagers.
Very typical.
Very typical of most teenagers, especially at that time with COVID, to feel sad. It was not unusual to hear that throughout the day.
Now, some of the statements on the math paper, you saw the statements that say things like, I love my life so much, and OHS, which I assume stands for Oxford High School, rocks, correct?
Yes.
Those kind of statements also, would you agree those are mixed signal kind of statements?
No, I would say it looks like you have a teenager who is trying to not get in trouble, knowing that the Dean of Students is involved. Most of the time when I'm involved in student meetings, the kids always think they're in trouble, which is not necessarily always the case. So I looked at that as he was trying to get himself out of being in trouble. Thinking he was going to be in trouble from this meeting we were holding.
And that was something that's not unusual for you to see?
That's not unusual, no.
That doesn't mean there's a threat to you?
That doesn't mean there's a threat, no.
In terms of Oxford and the area community, you're familiar with the fact that students at the school, there are many who are interested in hunting, guns, target practice, that kind of thing, correct?
Yes, during hunting season, it's kind of like a reminder that sort of gets put out for students that go hunting in the mornings before the late start Wednesdays to remember to not come to school in their gear and or have weapons in their vehicles from that morning. And like we've also had students that pose with guns for their homecoming pictures as well. So it's very common in the Oxford community.
Okay, so it's so common that there are students, they pose for homecoming
There have
pictures.
been students that'll pose with guns for homecoming photos.
When you're talking about homecoming photos, you're talking about like the dance.
They're dressed up at home and taking photos, correct?
So they're dressed up in their, little party dresses, and they're holding guns in the photographs before they go to the dance?
Yes.
And you're saying that there are students who go hunting in the mornings before even coming to school?
Yes. So at the time, we had late start Wednesdays, so school didn't start till 10, 20-ish. So when hunting season would start, they potentially could be out hunting with their parents in the morning.
So in addition to what you did know in this case, seeing a gun or talks of a gun, that was not something that caused alarm to make you think there was some kind of threat.
No, nor
Guns-
was I aware that he even had a gun.
Guns at that school are very common. Then it sounds like it's a common topic if they're in pictures of homecoming dresses and things like that.
I would say across many schools, it wouldn't be uncommon to see guns drawn on assignments or papers. Oftentimes, there are certain books or part of the curriculum, and students end up drawing guns to represent stuff in the stories.
Now, my understanding is that you guys recommended immediate care. I'm sorry, I'm going to strike that. I was going into a question I've already asked you. You did not think it was strange that the parents were not taking their son out of school, specifically with Mrs. Crumbley's son on November 30th, correct?
I did think it was strange that they didn't take their son.
You've testified before in civil cases regarding what happened at Oxford High School, correct?
I have, yes.
And specifically on September 14th of 2022, you testified in a deposition, correct?
That sounds about right, yes.
And when you testify in a deposition, it's not like a courtroom like this, right?
No, it's not.
But you still have to swear to tell the truth and take an oath before you testify.
Correct.
On that day, you were specifically asked, so them not taking Ethan home that day, you did not find that to be strange and out of the ordinary. Your answer was no. There would have been no reason for him to go home.
That was in regards to student discipline. So the context, I believe, is important there.
That's in regard to student discipline.
Correct.
But that was the question you were asked that day and the answer you gave.
In regards to being disciplined or suspended, correct.
And in terms of a mental health consideration, it was not something that arose to the level where, as a mandatory reporter, you would have to report the Crumbleys for being neglectful. We've already established that, correct?
Yes.
In the meeting you had, there was no indication, and there is nothing in Mrs. Crumbley's son's record to show there had ever been a previous concern about the need for mental health to Mr. Crumbley.
Judge, I think we've already answered this question.
Didn't we ask the sign?
No, I asked about prior discipline, but I didn't ask about prior notations mental health was necessary.
Okay, I'll allow it. Go ahead.
From a school standpoint, we did not have any record of mental health.
Now, when you testified previously, you testified that Mrs. Crumbley seemed receptive and willing to get mental health treatment for her son.
That was my understanding at the end of that meeting, yes.
Although maybe not that day, it was your understanding she was on board and was going to make an appointment or do something within 48 hours.
That was my understanding and hope.
When you were in the meeting and the struggle was discussed, ongoing struggle between the Crumbleys and their son, would you agree with me that the parents were making statements about they were concerned with their son's schoolwork and grades?
They just confirmed that they had the argument. They didn't provide any context or details about anything other than what he had shared with us before they arrived.
Were you aware there was a specific concern related to Mrs. Crumbley's son having missing assignments specifically?
The only information that she provided was that he struggled with virtual learning, which was confirming what he had also shared with us. But there was nothing specific that I remember her sharing.
And you would agree with me that when you meet with parents, parents all react differently to their child being brought down to the office.
That depends on the situation.
So depending on the situation, parents may have a variety of reactions.
It depends on it depends on what the meeting is, yeah. What the meeting is about, why we're meeting with the parents and the child.
Obviously, when parents come to the school, they're showing you a level of concern to make sure to handle whatever it is going on, correct?
Somewhat, yeah.
And you're aware that when the parents are coming to a meeting, they are going to be getting information and from you and from other professionals at the school.
As well as providing information that they have, because they're the experts on their child. So part of the meeting is to share what we have, but also to listen to confirmation or additional details about stuff that they might be seeing outside of school, at home. And that information was not provided.
There was no information provided to you that the Crumbleys had concerns over mental health issues. Fair to say?
That's fair to say.
I have nothing further.
You do that?